All right then. So today we're going to be talking about the new middle class in the pre-Civil War era, the cult of domesticity, and the birth of a women's rights movement. And we're focusing particularly on the period from the 1830s to the 1850s. And one thing it's very important to keep in mind is that today we're talking about a small but influential subset of American women: Northeastern, urban, middle class, white women. These are the women whose lives were changing in a very particular way and encouraging them to claim more influence in the United States and to try to focus on what their future political influence was going to be. Domesticity was an ideal that immured women in the home. Essentially, it removed them from the public eye. Now, the interesting contradiction is that at the very moment when domesticity was at its height, the birth of the women's movement also took place. So women were finding new ways to go out and get involved in the public. They were actually building on what might at first glance seem like a fairly limited role. Much of what I'm going to say today about 19th century American women builds on some of the scholarship that began in the 1970s, 1980s, and although there have been many revisions to those ideas since that time, some of these historians came up with some very significant new understandings of women's lives, family lives, and certainly their interpretations sometimes fell short in terms of describing the diversity of women's lives, something later historians have tried to compensate for. But there's a lot of really good work that was done early on. And in fact, if you're interested in reading further, there's going to be a slide at the end of the presentation that gives you some of those sources. We've been talking a lot in this class lately about some of the major forces of the antebellum era, and particularly the shift toward new market and manufacturing economies, and the almost simultaneous upsurge of evangelical Protestantism and mass conversion, particularly, again, in the urban Northeast during the Second Great Awakening. But we haven't yet discussed more specifically how some of these ideas affected women and their lives. Both ideas about gender, that is, the socially and culturally constructed understandings of difference between the sexes, and gender roles, that is, expectations for behavior for men and women, were changing fundamentally during this era. As you'll recall, at the beginning of the 19th century, the male head of household was still regarded, both legally and culturally, as the patriarch and the provider. Women and children were simply legal and economic dependents, though they frequently performed significant, economically valuable work within the home. As had been true for the Puritan family, women were subjugated to the will of their husbands, but couples still worked at that time side by side in farms and in household production. And so their lives became increasingly disconnected with the advent of the market economy, the removal of work from the home, the divergence of work and leisure time, and the beginnings of the new consumer culture. So husbands and wives went from having sort of day-to-day shared economic and child-rearing responsibilities to having more distinctive spheres of influence and responsibility. Now, as I said, traditionally, households had been responsible for the production of goods of one kind or another. But this was no longer the case in the newly private northern, urban, middle-class home of the nuclear family. And that's the home and the family as we understand it now, a place that didn't include servants or economic dependents, such as journeymen who were still in training. The social significance of the new middle class home and the economic significance was actually going to be not its role in the production of goods, but its reproductive role in the production of children, the next generation of the middle class. So perhaps surprisingly, given that child rearing was increasingly becoming women's sole reproductive function, the average family size for native-born American wives, for instance in upstate New York, decreased sharply, went down by nearly half between the 18 teens and the 1850s. And this is based on some number crunching from the US Census, not performed by me. Women who began having children in the 1820s, so that is, their fertile years were in the 1820s and 30s, would average just over 5 children. 10 years later, women who were having children in the 1830s and 40s averaged only about 3.6 children each. So this is a 40% decline in reproduction. So you might be wondering, what are the causes of this drastic change? And what were some of the social effects? Well, first of all, as to immediate causes, some historians have pinpointed a massive upsurge in the number of abortions that were taking place in this period, dating at least as far back as the 1840s. And at this point, according to the Old English common law tradition, abortion was still a legal practice, at least until the moment of quickening. That's basically the moment at which the woman could feel the baby kick. So common law did not consider an abortion within the first 4 or 5 months of pregnancy as a criminal act. It was incredibly dangerous. Yeah, I mean, so first of all, some of the methods involved poisons, purgatives, calomel, and then there were also very primitive surgical methods that could result in infection and death. So it was a dangerous undertaking. So clearly, it had to be very important for women to control the size of their families in order for them to go through these procedures. What's interesting about this is that it's married women who were getting more abortions during this period. We might have assumed that it was working class women or unmarried women, young unwed mothers, but in fact, it was those same urban middle class wives who were taking control of reproduction. And in addition, they were also using other methods, some fairly ineffective and primitive birth control methods, and also the practice of sexual abstinence within marriage. This is something that women were newly claiming a right to. Now, at the same time that women were reducing the size of their families, their role in child rearing was beginning to assume new import. They were gaining the lead responsibility, not just a shared responsibility, for raising and educating their sons and daughters as good and moral citizens. Motherhood itself, actually, was coming to be seen as not just a natural part of life, but also as sort of a profession for which women had to be trained and given at least a modicum of education. Motherhood was increasing in status. On the other hand, children no longer had a productive economic role to play, except in farm families. So the middle class had the option of beginning to limit family size. But the question remains, if motherhood was increasing in status, why did women want to have fewer children? Well, for one thing, with the smaller number of children in the new middle class family, there were fewer opportunities for error. And there were some significant advantages in decreasing the size of the family. Husbands and wives were more intensively raising the smaller number of children that they had. The significance here is that to sustain middle-class life across generations, it was no longer possible to just pass on a family fortune or a tract of land. Instead, as today, middle-class living was a sort of tenuous status. It was something that involved a mode of living and the acquisition of skills necessary in order to earn enough money in the future to maintain a middle-class lifestyle. So given that, in order for this to happen, sons needed education, they needed professional skills, perhaps some further education, maybe to be set up in a business. Daughters, in particular, had to be trained up to develop the manners that distinguished them from the lower classes, in addition to that modicum of education and training that made them suitable mothers. So middle-class children of both sexes had to be educated and cultivated in a way that had never occurred before. Middle-class parents were simply concentrating their financial resources in order to increase their children's chance of success. During this period, middle-class women were being placed and were placing themselves on something of a pedestal. This pedestal was ideologically constructed. And this new creation was the image of Victorian womanhood that you're probably all familiar with. And this was the period during which ladies' magazines and advice manuals began to tell young women what they should look like, how they should behave. They began reading novels that described what their interior lives were supposed to be like, sort of new romanticization of their lives. And some of these magazines and advice manuals were actually instrumental in spreading the ideals of domesticity and the idea that women should be placed on a pedestal. They published articles like "Woman, Man's Best Friend." It's not exactly the same man's best friend that we think of today with that phrase. But in the moment, it was expressing not only a sense of what woman's duty was, but what the potential was for companionate marriage, for a marriage that would be emotionally satisfying, as well as sort of economically satisfactory. Now, the most prominent of the magazines was Godey's Lady's Book. And it's kind of ironic, actually. That magazine's highly successful female editor was a widow. She was a mother of 5. And despite the pleasure that she took in her work, which she did very well, she always stated that she would have preferred to stay at home raising her children if only her husband's death hadn't put her in the position of having to support them. So despite the fact that she was a very early and nationally prominent career woman, Sarah Josepha Hale actually would have preferred to fulfill the traditional womanly responsibilities and remain within the home, to remain within the boundaries of domesticity. Now, fashion plate images, like the one you see here from an 1856 issue of Godey's Lady's Book, showed women not only the latest styles of dress, but also sort of what a generalized incarnation of the valued ideal of womanhood would look like and how she might behave. They tended to be depicted in pastoral or domestic settings. Rarely did you see women in mixed groups. Rarely did you see them, actually at the ball. They showed the pictures of the women in ball gowns in the house, which was their appropriate sphere. So, what do you see in this image? What does this tell you about Victorian womanhood? She's gazing at herself. So simultaneously, she's checking herself out, but she's also checking to make sure that she's adhering to the prescription of how she's supposed to look. So both of those things are going on at the same time, and it wasn't uncommon to see an image of a woman standing before a mirror in these fashion plate images. Anything else that you notice? So it was her responsibility to meet the sort of expected standard of what women were supposed to look like, as well as how they were supposed to behave. I think the other thing that you see in this image is this is a young woman. She's sort of sedate and pure and serene. Perhaps she's waiting for her husband to come home so she can cater to his needs. Or perhaps she is imagining meeting a future lover, who of course would become a husband. That was a given. But she was sort of the incarnation of feminine attributes of spirituality, comfort, purity. Now, this image was an ideal and not a reality, and it bears emphasizing that. And for those of you who are interested in reading 19th century novels, there's one that I can highly recommend. In fact, it doesn't read like the normal 19th century melodrama because it was written by a female newspaper columnist who was a humorist. Fanny Fern was her pseudonym. And the novel is Ruth Hall. It came out just 1 year before that image came out in Godey's Lady's Book. And the central point of Ruth Hall, which was a semi-autobiographical novel, was that when Ruth Hall was widowed, her family had failed in its responsibility to her. And so she, not unlike the editor of Godey's Lady's Book, was forced to go out and try to make her way in the world, where she found that there was no appropriate occupation for women. She had friends who employed seamstresses, and they refused to employ her, despite her skill, because they thought that was beneath her class standing. Meanwhile, she and her children were starving in a garret. But honestly, this is still, 150 years later, a great read, so highly recommended. So that's the reality. But there was also a reality that correlated with the ideal of domesticity. With the beginning of the factory revolution, there were newly available commercial products. And the rise of the new middle class allowed married women to retreat into the home. What was increasingly referred to as woman's sphere. That's not just a term that historians use. It was constantly referred to at the time. What was woman's appropriate sphere? There were women who had no desire to expand that sphere, and there were other women who were constantly pushing the boundaries, like the author of Ruth Hall. By implication, everything outside woman's sphere, so the streets, the world of commerce, the world of politics, all of those things were man's appropriate sphere. Women were not invited. It's important to keep in mind the newfound haven of the domestic sphere constituted, in a way, both a critique and an accommodation of the exigencies of market capitalism. And by that I mean, it was both a reaction against the cruel world of commerce, creating a refuge within the home, but it didn't challenge that world head on. In fact, one might say that providing men with a refuge at the end of a hard work day made it more possible for them to live in that cruel world of commerce outside. So no longer simply the household. This new conception of home was as a refuge from a ruthless world of economic competition. And the valorization of the home and of the wife and mother was part of what's referred to as a cult of domesticity, or sometimes a cult of true womanhood. Now, these cult labels were applied by modern scholars. And sometimes people actually don't want to use them anymore because they say it's pejorative to call something a cult. But on the other hand, the terms true woman, true womanhood, domesticity, these were key terms of the time, and they expressed fundamental, deeply held beliefs that shaped how individuals saw themselves and the world around them. They shaped their worldviews, not unlike the way that religious beliefs did. Now, domesticity was not the only critique of capitalism, and it certainly wasn't the only cultural reaction against a changing society that was going to transform how women lived in the world. Now, as you'll recall from your reading, things had started changing in the 1820s and 30s when many of the same women who would soon endeavor to fulfill their new domestic ideal had begun to convert to evangelical Protestantism and begun working to perfect themselves and the world around them as part of the Second Great Awakening. And you'll recall from Shopkeeper's Millennium, there was that husband who lamented the fact that once his wife was visited by Minister Charles Finney during the revivals, she sort of had a new delusion of her own importance. And in his words, he felt that the peace, quiet, and happiness had fled his home and would never return. Basically, this man felt that his wife's new sense of herself as, if not a social equal, as someone who was spiritually equal to her husband and had a certain amount of spiritual and moral authority, was destroying his authority within the home. In some cases, it was actually this new sense of individual agency that went along with religious conversion that made women's new involvement in the outside world and in reform work possible. Women soon built on their newfound moral authority, and they even used it as an excuse to go out into public, which is pretty impressive considering that the whole point of the domestic ideal was to keep women in private. But since women were regarded as being uniquely emotional and spiritual, while men were seen as sort of more rational political creatures, women were able to make the argument that their moral influence, not in politics per se, but their moral influence in the outside world would improve the public morality in a way that men couldn't do. So some of these women, they got involved in various causes. They were circulating petitions, attending meetings, marching in parades, sometimes even speaking before what were referred to as promiscuous assemblies. And that thrilling phrase is simply meant to indicate that audiences contained both men and women. They were mixed. They might even include members of different races or social classes. So these were public assemblies. These were not social events that were extensions of the world of the home. One of these women was Abby Kelly, and she provides a great illustration of the ways in which spiritual inspiration, women's new sense of godly authority, and women's reform work all came together. Abby Kelly was a Quaker-raised New Englander, and while still a young woman, she became deeply involved in the cause of abolition. There was still at this time significant resistance, not merely to abolitionism, but to the idea of a woman speaking in public on almost any topic. However, Kelly, with her dynamic manner, soon became one of the abolition movement's most sought-after speakers, and she crisscrossed back and forth throughout the Northeast and Midwestern states, speaking for her cause. Kelly's public performances implicitly challenged the notion that women belonged only in the private sphere. And at the same time, perhaps more importantly, her work toward the abolition of slavery caused her to formulate an explicit position on women's rights. So this was a young woman who perhaps hadn't spent a lot of time before thinking about her position in society. But she described a revelation that was undoubtedly familiar to many other female anti-slavery reformers when she said, "In striving to strike his irons off, we found most surely that we were manacled ourselves." So what she was saying here is that in working to free African American slaves, and in the process of justifying slaves' freedom under principles of Christian morality and newly expanding principles of natural rights and equality, female reformers like Abby Kelly began to perceive parallels between slaves' illegitimate, unfree status and their own lives. And these women soon applied the fundamental abolitionist doctrines of universal freedom and equality to their own sex. In fact, we can see directly that not only was it the ideals of abolitionism, it was also the training and frustrations of involvement in abolitionist reform that sparked the formation of a distinct and separate women's rights movement. In 1840, two major female abolitionists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, went to London to attend the World Anti-Slavery Convention. And they were pretty horrified to find that although they were delegates to the convention, they were not allowed to participate on the convention floor because of their sex. They were relegated to the gallery. They were mere spectators, no longer included as a part of the movement. So it wasn't too many years later, in 1848, that Stanton and Mott were among the activists who put together the first national American Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls in New York. And you might recall that Seneca Falls was part of that burned over district of incredibly intense social change and revivalism along the Erie Canal. So this is just another example of that link between economic change, social change, religious change, and the roots of reform. Okay, so after much deliberation, the delegates at the Seneca Falls Convention issued what they termed a Declaration of Sentiments. They didn't call it a Declaration of Independence, but they were very consciously emulating the American Revolutionary Declaration of Independence. And they were applying its principles of equality to the state of woman. And you'll be able to read this later on. But if you just take a quick look, are there any phrases in particular that strike you in any way? I've got a few of my own. Yeah, pretty extreme. Anything else? He has made her. And, So demonstrating man's authority over women, but also an illegitimate authority, maybe. And I mean, it really does remind you of some of the language of the Founding Fathers and some of the blame, for instance, that Thomas Jefferson wanted to place on the king. And they talked about that kind of absolute tyranny. One of the other things that I notice is that claim that man had made woman in the eye of the law civilly dead. So that civil death is something that we've talked about before in relation to the idea of social death. In relation to the idea of social death, with regard to the status of slavery. So again, you see that women's rights activists were calling on that experience of abolitionism, abolitionist reform, and abolitionist principles in formulating their own demands and their own complaints. So these are just a few excerpts from what starts out with the claim that men and women were created equal, and a list of grievances that end with a claim to greater rights and privileges and recognition as citizens of these United States. At the same time that this document was very extreme, it also accommodated sort of the common cultural expectations that limited women's activities. For one thing, just the fact that it's called a declaration of sentiments. I mean, sentiment, that's one of those things that women were supposed to be particularly fitted for. Not reason, but emotion. So they're expressing their emotions in a declaration that is also a petition to the men who control the government. They recognized that under the Old English common law, many American women had the status of femmes covert, which is an Old English legal term. Now, at the beginning of the 19th century and throughout the century, unmarried women who had achieved adulthood and widows were still able to conduct themselves as femmes sole. So they were women who stood alone. They could conduct business, they could sign contracts, they could sue and be sued. They were basically responsible for their own actions and their own futures. Married women, on the other hand, immediately took on the status of the femme covert. That is, marriage was to them a civil death. And during the period of their marriage, there was a long-term suspension of basically their civil existence. They had no longer any direct relationship to their government. No right to independently contract business, no right to control their own property. Although some of these things were just beginning to change with the women's rights movement of the pre-Civil War era. The first married women's property law, for instance, was actually the same year as the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848 in New York. Now, the one demand that the Seneca Falls women did not make in the Declaration of Sentiments was they did not ask for suffrage. Many of these women, I mean, this wasn't just a practical consideration, although it was also that. Many women's rights activists in the early 19th century actively objected to the idea of having the vote. And that was something that actually divided the women's movement of the time and would continue to divide that movement. But instead, the rights and privileges that these women were asking for were simply the right to some kind of civil existence, some kind of recognition that they were individuals with a direct relationship to their government, that their identity wasn't simply covered over by that of their husband upon marriage. They wanted to be able to manage their own money, their own property. They wanted access to better education. They wanted respect for their abilities. They wanted to be able to go out into the public sphere and improve the public morality through their inherent feminine capability for moral purity and moral influence. So this is where it sort of all ties back to the domestic ideal that simultaneously disempowered and empowered women. That's actually a really interesting question. Many of them probably subscribed to Godey's Lady's Book. Many of them adhered to sort of surface expectations for how women were supposed to behave and had no objection to adhering to whatever it was, the style of the time. On the other hand, there were women who believed in specifically not reading novels because they thought that they sort of destroyed women's minds, and who also believed that there should be dress reform because they thought that the restrictive clothing was part of what restricted women's lives. And actually, I was going to show you this image next. This is an image of a later women's rights convention, also taking place in New York. This one's from the late 1850s. But if you look, you can see, yes, the dress reform woman. That's actually a pretty extreme version of dress reform. There were women who believed that they could wear sort of a combination of like a shorter skirt and pantaloons or bloomers. And this is, you know, like might seem fairly reasonable to us, but to women who had been brought up to believe that showing their ankles was not respectable, this was considered very, very extreme. So this is actually a cartoon from Harper's Weekly, which was a Republican publication. So read, a publication published by and supported by abolitionists. So those are the male liberal Christian reformers who were the counterparts of women who became involved in women's rights. What else do you see in this picture, though? Yeah, the angry men railing away, relegated to the balconies in exactly the same way that Stanton and Mott were relegated to the balconies at the Anti-Slavery World Convention in London 20 years earlier. Anything else in terms of some of the caricatures of the attendees at this convention? I think she's actually, I think it's like a monocle and she's looking up at the men in the balcony. But when you say this women are slouching, leaning backward, I mean, this woman has her skirts in the air. So clearly there's this implicit link between women's activism, women in public, and sexual misbehavior. The other thing that I find particularly entertaining is the number of sort of, for lack of a better phrase, dried up old maids that you see in the audience. So apparently, the men who edited Harper's Weekly and drew for Harper's Weekly, though they themselves were Christian activists and reformers, they were from the same groups of people that these women's rights activists came from. They were clearly objecting, and they were trying to portray women's rights women as seeking not equality, but rather superiority, relegating the men off the main floor of the convention. There are not a lot of young, vigorous, attractive men in the audience. I think you have over here you have a man with a sort of old school, biblical, patriarchal beard, which at this point in time might have indicated that he was a member of some obscure religious group or perhaps utopian group. So they're using all of these different methods to link women's rights with illegitimate behavior and lack of legitimate access to the public and to politics. On the other hand, no matter how disturbing women's rights was to many men, it remained on the back burner in the period before the Civil War. It got a lot of press, and there were some conventions, and the roots of activism came into being. But the center and the central goal of reformist activism during this period remained the abolition of slavery. And the majority of female activists remained engaged in abolitionism and recognized that their first goal was to free slaves. After the Civil War, though, when emancipation and enfranchisement supposedly solved the situation of African Americans, that would be the moment when efforts for women's rights would once again pick up speed. But that is the subject for another lecture. So unless there are any questions, I think we're done for the day.